the frozen heart of Russia, January 1943, the world's attention was fixed on the inferno of Stalingrad, a city reduced to rubble, yet destined to become a symbol of Soviet defiance. But far from the front lines, inside the heavily guarded walls of the Kremlin, another battle was being fought. One not of bullets and blood, but of fear, secrecy, and health. Behind closed doors, a man who would never appear in official war histories quietly took notes that could have altered the world's understanding of Joseph Stalin. His name was Dr. Ivan Kliun, Stalin's personal physician. At 51, Kliun was a decorated medical officer who had once treated soldiers during the Winter War against Finland. His loyalty to the party was unquestioned, his discretion absolute. Yet, in the quiet hours of those years, he began writing what he called his observations, private diary entries describing the erratic moods, sleepless nights, and growing paranoia of the man who ruled the Soviet Union. Each entry was coded, written in the margins of medical ledgers, and hidden behind false bindings. He knew what even a whisper of such records could mean: exile, torture, or death. Kliun's proximity to power was unprecedented. Few men could claim to see Stalin without layers of intermediaries. He was summoned at all hours, often to dakas outside Moscow, where the air smelled of pipe smoke and the weight of history hung heavy in the silence. There, Kliun watched the dictator pace his study, consumed by anxiety over the Wehrmacht's advance and distrustful of every report brought to him by his generals. The doctor noted the trembling of Stalin's hands, the shallow breaths, and the sleeplessness that fueled bursts of rage. He prescribed mild sedatives and rest, remedies Stalin ignored. While Soviet forces under General Chuikov fought block by block in Stalingrad, Kliun's own war was internal. His duty demanded silence, yet his conscience demanded record. He wrote, "Comrade Stalin does not trust his generals, nor his own body. He fears weakness above all." These words, hidden in his medical files, would one day become the core of what historians now call the Lost Diaries. Outside the Kremlin, the machinery of war ground forward relentlessly. The Red Army encircled Paulus's Sixth Army, and victory seemed within reach. But inside the Kremlin, the mood was far from celebratory. Reports of traitors and saboteurs filled the air. Even high-ranking officials were not safe from Stalin's suspicion. Kliun treated men who vanished days later, officials who complained of fatigue or headaches, only to disappear after a private meeting with the general secretary. The doctor began to fear that every prescription he wrote, every note he made, might be used as evidence against him. By spring, the long-awaited Soviet victory at Stalingrad had turned the tide of the war. But for Kliun, it marked the beginning of another kind of tension. The knowledge that the war outside was being won, while the war inside Stalin's mind was consuming him. The doctor's notes began to take on a darker tone. He wrote, "He no longer speaks of comradeship, only of survival. He asks who among us will live to see peace." Historians now understand that Stalin's health during these years was more precarious than anyone dared admit. Declassified NKVD records reveal that he suffered recurring bouts of hypertension, chest pains, and tremors. Conditions Kliun tried desperately to manage, but no illness frightened Stalin more than weakness. When Kliun suggested a reduction in workload, Stalin snapped, "Russia does not rest, doctor. Why should I?" By late 1943, as Allied leaders met in Tehran to plan the final push against Hitler, Stalin's doctor was quietly updating his coded journal. He knew that what he observed was dangerous knowledge, proof that the man who led the world's largest army was not invincible. Rumors swirled through the Kremlin's corridors. The doctor had been seen writing at night, that his notes might contain more than medicine. In one entry, the last complete one found in what historians believe was Kliun's hand, he wrote, "The war outside may end, but the one inside these walls will not. Truth is more feared here than any bullet." That winter, as the snow fell over a wounded nation, Dr. Ivan Kliun sealed his diary beneath the floorboards of his Moscow quarters. It would remain there, unseen, for decades. And though the Red Army's banners soon waved over Stalingrad's ruins, Kliun's quiet rebellion, a record of the man behind the myth, had only just begun. Some say the diary was never meant to be found. Others believe it was a final act of conscience from a man trapped in history's shadow. But one thing was certain: within those hidden pages lay a truth that neither Stalin's power nor time itself could completely erase. The question that lingers even now: who first discovered that the doctor was writing? Spring, 1944. The snows around Moscow were melting, and with them, the illusion that the Allied powers fully trusted one another. The Red Army was pushing westward, reclaiming territory inch by inch from the Wehrmacht. Yet inside the marble corridors of the Kremlin, the war took on another dimension, one of nerves, secrecy, and espionage. It was in this atmosphere that the British quietly sent a team of medical and technical advisors to Moscow under the guise of wartime health cooperation. Few knew that one of their true objectives was to learn more about the failing health of Joseph Stalin, and about the mysterious doctor said to be keeping detailed records of it. Dr. Ivan Klein, who had served Stalin faithfully for years, now found himself at the center of invisible cross-currents between East and West. British intelligence, through channels within the Special Operations Executive (SOE) and the Office of Strategic Services (OSS), had begun hearing rumors from their contacts in the Soviet Medical Corps. The rumors spoke of a physician who fears the man he serves, and a journal of confessions. Such whispers were not ignored. In the world of intelligence, even a rumor could become a weapon. The official mission arrived in Moscow in early April 1944, headed by Brigadier Harold Whitlock, a respected British Army surgeon who had coordinated with the Soviet Medical Service after Stalingrad. His cover story was simple: evaluate battlefield sanitation and share Western advances in trauma medicine. But Whitlock's private brief, marked Top Secret, Limited, contained a single paragraph that revealed the mission's second purpose: ascertain the truth behind reports of Stalin's declining health, determine the credibility of the physician known as Klein. The British were cautious. Moscow was a city wrapped in suspicion. NKVD agents monitored every movement of foreign delegates. Hotel telephones were tapped, and interpreters often doubled as informants. Still, through a network of embassy physicians and Soviet colleagues, Whitlock's team managed to obtain copies of internal Soviet medical supply requisitions, forms that revealed the use of rare barbiturates and heart medications reserved only for the highest offices. Someone inside the Kremlin was treating serious cardiac symptoms. Meanwhile, Klein's own unease deepened. He had noticed men following him through the hospital corridors, his assistants being replaced without explanation, and questions being asked about his private notes. When an NKVD officer requested access to his patient logs for inspection, Klein understood that the rumors of his diary had reached the wrong ears. He began hiding his documents not at home, but within the medical archives of Hospital No. 1, mislabeled as supplies inventory ledgers. In his coded writings from that spring, Klein described Stalin's condition as volatile, noting tremors, high blood pressure, and insomnia aggravated by paranoia. He speaks of Roosevelt and Churchill as wolves in sheep's clothing, one entry reads, and of his own comrades as weaker wolves. His professional detachment was eroding. He was treating not only a patient, but a regime embodied in a single, unpredictable man. British intelligence, aware of the danger, decided to test the waters. In June, a confidential memo from the OSS Moscow station, codenamed Baker, reached London. It referenced a Soviet doctor of importance, contact improbable but desirable, believed to have information of both political and medical significance. MI6 agreed to discreetly signal its interest through diplomatic channels, but no approach could be made without Soviet consent. They would have to wait and watch. What neither side knew was that Stalin himself had been informed of possible Western curiosity about his health. The NKVD launched a quiet internal operation under Deputy Commissar Merkulov to identify the leak. Medical staff were interrogated, personal files were examined, some simply disappeared. Dr. Klein, summoned twice to Lubyanka for routine questioning, returned shaken but unharmed. His assistant, however, was never seen again. In an entry dated August 5, 1944, Klein wrote, "They ask what I have written, to whom I have spoken. I tell them nothing, yet the walls hear everything. My words are safer on paper than on my tongue." As the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy that summer, the divide between East and West began to widen. The Western powers celebrated liberation in France. Stalin saw opportunity and treachery. When he learned that the Anglo-Americans had delayed opening the Second Front, his trust evaporated. That bitterness seeped into his every interaction, every decision, and Cleon was there to witness it. His pulse races when he speaks of London, the doctor noted. He suspects betrayal, even in victory. By autumn, whispers of Cleon's potential defection or disappearance had already reached the British embassy. One intercepted Soviet cable, later declassified, warned that the doctor is unstable and must be monitored. To Western intelligence, that could mean only one thing. Someone inside the Kremlin was under investigation, and time was running out. In November 1944, as the Red Army prepared for its final push into Eastern Europe, the OSS reported that its Moscow medical source had gone silent. No further information about Stalin's condition or the diary reached Allied ears. Was it fear that silenced Dr. Cleon, or something more permanent? The last line of his surviving journal from that year reads simply, "They watch me as I watch him. One of us will not survive the end of this war." June 1944. The thunder of war echoed across Europe as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The world hailed the beginning of the end for Hitler's Third Reich. But in Moscow, another kind of storm was gathering. Behind the red-bricked walls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin's distrust of his Western allies deepened into obsession. To his personal physician, Dr. Ivan Cleon, the supreme leader was not merely aging or ill, he was unraveling. For months, Cleon had watched his patient's decline with increasing alarm. The exhaustion was visible. A shaking hand when lighting his pipe, fainting spells behind closed doors, and an unpredictable temper that terrified even the most loyal aides. Cleon's diary entries for that summer, written in ciphered shorthand and concealed among harmless medical reports, described nights where Stalin would summon his generals past midnight, berate them for treachery, and then fall silent, staring at the portraits of Lenin that lined his study. He speaks less of victory, Cleon wrote, and more of ghosts, not of the dead, but of those who might still betray him. The strain of command was immense. Every front demanded Stalin's approval. Operation Bagration in Belarus, the push toward Warsaw, the siege of Budapest. But his health faltered with every communiqué. NKVD guards noted his absence from key meetings and his irritability when confronted with Allied updates. The more the Western press celebrated D-Day, the more suspicious Stalin became of their motives. To him, the delay in opening a second front had been proof of Anglo-American duplicity. They wanted us to bleed first, he told Molotov. Now they arrive to claim victory. Dr. Cleon's reports on Stalin's physical state, elevated blood pressure, chronic insomnia, heart arrhythmia, were carefully filed. But he began to notice red pencil markings on the folders, the sign of NKVD review. Someone was reading his medical records, likely without Stalin's knowledge. Within the Kremlin's secretive medical department, whispers spread. The doctor had grown too curious, too candid. And yet, amid the danger, Cleon kept writing. His diary took on the tone of a confession. "I treat a man possessed by his own victories. The war outside cannot match the one within him. He trusts no one, not his generals, not his comrades, not even his pulse." That same summer, rumors reached the Western allies of Stalin's erratic behavior. American diplomats stationed at the Moscow embassy recorded unexplained cancellations of meetings, moments of sudden anger, and a tendency to disappear for days. OSS cables described a leadership paralysis, though no one dared speculate openly on its cause. The British Foreign Office, aware of Cleon's existence through intercepted Soviet communications, classified the information as psychological intelligence, useful but unverifiable. To them, Cleon was a ghost within the Kremlin. His name whispered, never spoken aloud. The atmosphere inside Moscow grew darker as the Red Army advanced toward Eastern Europe. The NKVD's net tightened. Officers loyal to Beria compiled detailed surveillance files on Kremlin staff, including medical personnel. Cleon was called to sign additional loyalty declarations, his movements increasingly restricted. A chauffeur and bodyguard now accompanied him everywhere. Protection, they said, though he understood it as supervision. Still, there were moments of fleeting humanity. In one entry dated August 1944, Cleon described Stalin asking, almost gently, "Do you think men remember their doctors when they die?" Kliun answered only, "If they live long enough." "Perhaps," Stalin's response, a long silence, followed by a single order. "No more sedatives." The dictator's mind, it seemed, was determined to outlast his body as the front lines moved westward. Stalin's isolation grew absolute. At night, Kliun would sit in his quarters near the Kremlin armory, the distant rumble of artillery carried by the wind, and write. He paces the floors like a caged wolf. Even in silence, his eyes accuse. "I fear he sees the guilt that I hide on these pages." By late 1944, the strain had reached breaking point. NKVD interrogators questioned him about missing morphine doses, alleged errors in medical reports, and contacts with foreign nationals. He denied all. "Medicine is my duty," he told them, "not politics." They released him, and for now. But his assistants vanished one by one. One morning, Kliun entered his clinic to find his notes gone and his office sealed. His name was quietly removed from the roster of Stalin's personal staff. Western intelligence intercepted a Soviet communication in November 1944, referencing a necessary replacement due to unreliability. Analysts later identified this as a likely reference to Kliun, but no arrest record, no death certificate, no official dismissal was ever filed. It was as if he had evaporated. His final surviving note, recovered decades later, bore a chilling sentence. "The war outside may end, but the war inside this man will bury us all." When Stalin re-emerged before his generals in January 1945, gaunt but defiant, the doctor who had once treated him was nowhere to be seen. Within the Kremlin's archives, Kliun's name would appear only once more, in a list marked Personnel, Restricted Access, Confidential Security Risk. Whatever truth Dr. Ivan Kliun carried in his diaries, it was now buried beneath layers of Soviet secrecy. And as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, a question remained unanswered in the shadowed halls of Moscow. Had Kliun escaped, been silenced, or chosen to vanish on his own terms? January 1945. The Red Army thundered westward through Poland, crushing the remnants of Hitler's Wehrmacht. Europe trembled as Stalin's forces approached the Oder River. Yet amid the triumph of advancing armies, a quieter drama was unfolding in the corridors of Moscow's intelligence machinery, one that would later vanish into the dark folds of classified history. It began with a British intelligence intercept, dated January 14, 1945, labelled only File 47 Delta. The message mentioned a Soviet medical source offering strategic intelligence of a physiological nature. To the analysts in London, it was an odd phrase, but to historians today, it may have been the first written trace of Dr. Ivan Kliun's attempt to reach beyond the Iron Curtain. At the time, the British government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park was intercepting thousands of Soviet diplomatic cables, though few were decrypted. The phrase File 47 Delta appeared in a partially decoded report, routed to MI6's Section 9, the division responsible for counter-communist intelligence. The content hinted at relevant data from medical archives concerning the General Secretary. British analysts speculated that someone inside the Kremlin was attempting to communicate information about Stalin's condition, possibly for asylum or leverage. The Soviets, of course, knew their communications were being watched. Any such leak could only come from desperation, or from a man already marked. Within the Soviet Union, paranoia had reached fever pitch. The NKVD had initiated an internal investigation under Deputy Commissar Merkulov known as Operation Trustmark. Its purpose, to root out anyone suspected of communicating with Western agencies. Among the targets listed were a handful of military doctors with Kremlin access. One name stood out, Kliun, Ivan Andreevich. The man had already been under suspicion for irregular record-keeping. His last confirmed sighting within the Kremlin was mid-December 1944, when he attended a routine check on Stalin's blood pressure. After that, no log entries bore his signature. British intelligence, cautious but intrigued, pursued the lead. An MI6 case officer stationed in Ankara, a neutral listening post for Soviet-related intelligence, received word through a Polish intermediary that a Russian doctor seeks protection, possesses materials of political gravity. The message was vague, unsigned, and ultimately inconclusive. But in London, it raised eyebrows. Could the source behind File 47 Delta and this elusive doctor be one and the same? Meanwhile, inside Moscow, the machinery of silence began its work. Stalin's personal guard was reorganized, files were burned, senior staff were rotated out. Even the Kremlin's internal medical archives were sealed under emergency wartime protocols. NKVD records declassified decades later show a chilling pattern. Several physicians attached to Stalin's security detail either reassigned or declared missing in service. It was the quietest kind of purge, one without announcements, one designed to erase. Among historians, the timeline remains murky. One account suggests that Kliun was seen leaving a Moscow safe house in January 1945 with a sealed satchel, possibly containing his coded diaries. Another version, drawn from later testimonies of Soviet defectors, claims he was intercepted by state security near the Riga rail line before he ever crossed the western frontier. What happened next is buried in speculation. Still, a faint echo of Kliun's existence persisted. In March 1945, as the Allies prepared their final assault on Germany, an anonymous document surfaced in British channels. It contained what appeared to be excerpts from a Soviet physician's notes that describing a leader plagued by suspicion and a pulse that quickens at the mention of Allies. The writing style matched none of the British analysts', and though unsigned, it was accompanied by a note stamped Source Moscow, 1944. MI6 archived it under restricted status, citing uncertainty of provenance. To this day, that document remains one of the few tangible links to the so-called lost diaries. Inside the Kremlin, the disappearance of Kliun caused ripples of unease among those who had known him. His former assistant, a nurse named Galina Petrovna, was questioned repeatedly about his whereabouts. He was tired, she reportedly told interrogators. He said he wanted to leave Moscow for air that was cleaner. Her testimony was the last mention of Kliun in any Soviet document until the 1990s. By late April 1945, as Berlin fell, Stalin himself appeared invigorated. The end of Hitler's empire was near, yet victory only deepened his mistrust. He ordered Beria to destroy redundant or classified health records, including those pertaining to internal consultations. Entire cabinets of medical documentation were burned in the courtyard of the Kremlin's hospital annex. The official reason was wartime consolidation of files. Unofficially, it erased any trace of the man who had once dared to write. Still, there was one more fragment to the story. An overlooked Soviet field report from May 1945. It described a convoy of medical transports retreating from Königsberg, shelled by German artillery. Among the debris, Soviet investigators later found scraps of correspondence written on hospital stationery, signed only IK. They were sent to Moscow but never catalogued. Some researchers now believe these may have been the remnants of Kliun's diary, either carried west in a desperate escape or destroyed in the chaos of war's final days. File 47 Delta was quietly archived and forgotten by the British Foreign Office after the war, deemed unverifiable. Its contents remained sealed until 1979, when declassification revealed the cryptic description of a medical informant, possibly deceased. The identity of that informant remains a mystery. Was Kliun truly reaching out to the West, or had British intelligence simply intercepted the dying words of a man already silenced? The answers may lie somewhere between the ash of a burned archive and the pulse of a patient who ruled half the world in fear. May 1945. Berlin was falling, the banners of the Red Army rising above the Reichstag. Across Europe, the guns that had thundered for 6 years were finally going silent. But in the shadows of victory, the Soviet Union began a quieter campaign, the sanitization of its own past. Files were sealed, witnesses reassigned, and inconvenient truths erased. Among the most carefully hidden were Stalin's personal health records, and the fate of the man who had once kept them, Dr. Ivan Kliun. With Germany defeated, the Kremlin moved swiftly to consolidate control over the conquered territories. Soviet medical and intelligence units were dispatched west to recover documents, equipment, and anything that might strengthen Moscow's hold over post-war Europe. One such convoy, designated Medical Brigade 122, Königsberg Sector, was tasked with securing archives abandoned by fleeing German hospitals. According to post-war Soviet dispatches, the unit also carried classified medical materials en route to Moscow. It was in this convoy Historians now believe that fragments of Kliun's writings resurfaced, only to vanish again. The war had left the Soviet medical corps scattered and exhausted. Amid the chaos, paperwork was easily lost, often deliberately. In June 1945, a brief report filed by Major Alexander Golubov of the Second Belarusian Front mentioned a curious discovery: partial documents written in cipher, referencing the health of senior leadership. The report was immediately sealed under NKVD directive. Its contents never saw the light of day. Golubov himself was transferred to an unknown post 2 months later. Somewhere between Königsberg and Moscow, the convoy carrying those papers was attacked. German holdouts, known as werewolf units, had ambushed several Red Army supply lines in the region. The records of Medical Brigade 122 end abruptly on May 14, 1945, when its lead truck failed to arrive at its checkpoint outside Vilnius. No official recovery mission was ever reported. When local villagers scavenged the wreckage weeks later, they found only scorched papers, surgical tools, and the remains of a single briefcase. Inside, charred but legible, were a few handwritten notes in Russian cursive. One fragment read, "The pulse of the motherland mirrors his own. When it stops, so will she." It bore the initials IK. News of the discovery filtered upward through the Soviet command structure, but never reached public record. Western intelligence, however, soon caught wind of it. Through intercepted military transmissions, British analysts pieced together the possibility that documents connected to Stalin's personal physician had been recovered. An MI6 memorandum from October 1945, marked for restricted circulation only, references partial recovery of unknown Soviet medical records, possibly concerning head of state health status. Authenticity undetermined. The memo was quickly buried under post-war priorities, overshadowed by the dawn of the atomic age and the emerging Cold War. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, Stalin's paranoia deepened. Victory had not brought peace. It had only reaffirmed his conviction that enemies lurked everywhere, especially within his own ranks. The wartime purges gave way to peacetime purges. Entire ministries were reorganized under new leadership. The People's Commissariat for Health was among the first to be cleansed. Hundreds of medical officers were dismissed or arrested under charges of professional negligence and anti-Soviet tendencies. Quietly, the official records of Dr. Ivan Kliun were among those destroyed. And yet, fragments persisted. In 1946, an American intelligence analyst reviewing captured German documents stumbled upon an unexpected find: a series of Soviet field reports referencing subject Kremlin medical oversight. Though incomplete, they included translated excerpts from what appeared to be a personal journal. "The patient's fear is absolute," one line read. "He cannot rest, for rest invites death." The document bore a note in English handwriting. "Recovered Königsberg, 1945. Unverified source." For decades, these fragments were dismissed as fabrications. Cold War scholars debated their authenticity, with some suggesting they were part of Western psychological operations designed to undermine Stalin's post-war image. But by the 1970s, as Soviet archives slowly opened to limited academic access, cross-references began to surface: Soviet security reports, KGB memoranda, and internal hospital rosters that all mentioned the physician Kliun, absent without record since December 1944. If Kliun's diary truly existed, it had traveled farther than he ever could. From the Kremlin to a battlefield convoy, to a burned briefcase in East Prussia, to dusty intelligence files in London and Washington. Each fragment carried a sliver of truth, yet none complete enough to confirm the whole. Historians described it as a confession scattered by war. By 1947, the Soviet propaganda machine had succeeded in erasing Kliun's name entirely. In official histories, Stalin's medical care was attributed to a team of anonymous physicians. The state newspaper, Pravda, praised the unyielding vigor of the Soviet leader, proclaiming him a man of iron health and revolutionary spirit. Behind the headlines, however, a different truth lingered, one written in the nervous scrawl of a doctor who had seen too much. Somewhere in the archives of British intelligence, one final note in File 47 Delta stood out. Typed in 1948 by an anonymous analyst, it read, "Source presumed deceased." Materials fragmented, possibly authentic. If genuine, they reveal a man both healer and prisoner, one who diagnosed the sickness of power itself. The last known page of what may have been Klyuhn's diary ended with a single line. "History will call me a traitor, but I served life against the shadow of death." Even today, the charred fragments found near Königsberg remain locked in vaults, their authenticity unverified. But to those who have seen them, the handwriting is unmistakable, steady, precise, and signed with two initials that refuse to fade. Ike. Moscow, 1991. The Soviet Union was crumbling. The red flags that once waved over half the world hung tattered in the chill of December air. Bureaucrats fled their offices with briefcases of files once marked top secret, and archives long sealed by fear began to breathe again. In a half-forgotten storage room beneath the old Ministry of Health building, a metal cabinet was pried open by a young archivist searching for inventory records. Inside were dusty folders labeled in fading Cyrillic. K-12, Confidential Correspondence, 1943-1945. Among them lay a small, cloth-bound notebook, brittle, water-stained and unsigned. But its contents would reignite one of the most enduring mysteries of the Second World War, the fate of Stalin's personal doctor, Ivan Andreyevich Klyuhn. The discovery spread quietly through Moscow's academic circles before reaching Western historians. Within days, microfilm copies were sent to London and Washington for analysis. The handwriting matched surviving Soviet medical reports from the 1940s. Each page bore the same cautious, meticulous script, the hand of a man used to writing under surveillance. Inside were brief reflections, clinical notations, and chilling fragments of introspection. The pulse of the leader is irregular. His body weakens, his will hardens. I treat not a man, but the state itself. Experts divided quickly. Some called the document an authentic relic of Stalin's inner circle. Others dismissed it as an elaborate post-war forgery. Yet one detail lent it weight: a recurring reference to Case File Delta, echoing the British intercept File 47 Hun Delta, first logged in 1945. Whoever wrote it had intimate knowledge of events that had never been public. The pages painted a portrait of a doctor trapped in moral conflict, torn between obedience to the regime and loyalty to truth. Klyuhn described sleepless nights in which he debated whether to hide his notes or destroy them. "Every heartbeat I measure," he wrote, "feels like a countdown, not to his death, but to my own." The entries abruptly ended in late December 1944, just before his disappearance. The final line read, "They have asked again about my papers. Tomorrow I will hide them where only silence can keep them." Modern analysts subjected the notebook to forensic examination. The paper stock, ink composition, and binding matched Soviet medical ledger materials from the period. Even the chemical degradation corresponded to storage in damp conditions, likely a basement or archive. And then there was the handwriting, precise yet uneven in the later pages, as if written under stress. The forensic report concluded: probable authenticity, author unconfirmed, but consistent with identified samples of Dr. Ivan A. Klyuhn. Still, mystery clung to every line. How had the diary survived the purges, the wars, and the decades of censorship? Some theorized it had been hidden by a sympathetic colleague within the Ministry of Health. Others believed it had been transferred to an NKVD archive and forgotten during the bureaucratic reshuffling of the post-war years. No official explanation has ever surfaced. The revelations contained in the K-12 archive did more than revive an old mystery. They reshaped the understanding of Stalin's final years. The entries portrayed a leader consumed by suspicion and decline, far from the image of unshakable authority projected by Soviet propaganda. One passage describes Stalin collapsing briefly after a late-night meeting with Beria in August 1944, revived only by Klyuhn's intervention. He forbade any record, the doctor wrote, but demanded to know if the West would hear of it. The fear that his weakness might be exploited by allies was a paranoia that haunted him until his death. Western historians, reading these lines decades later, saw reflections of other fallen regimes, where secrecy becomes sickness, and truth itself a forbidden medicine. Klyuhn's story, wrote British historian David Littleton, is not merely about one man's disappearance, but about how the human body became a battlefield for power. In Moscow, however, the rediscovery of the diaries sparked unease. The Russian government, still fragile in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse, swiftly restricted access to the originals. Official statements describe them as of questionable provenance and under ongoing evaluation. But behind the scenes, archivists whispered that several pages had gone missing soon after their rediscovery, likely removed before the folder reached state custody. The missing entries, they claimed, contained references to a Western contact and a promise of protection. If true, it would mean that Clune did make contact with Allied intelligence before vanishing. That File 47 Delta had indeed been his cry for escape. Yet no proof has ever surfaced, and no trace of his remains has been found. His disappearance remains one of the many unspoken secrets buried beneath Stalin's empire of silence. Today, the surviving fragments of Clune's diary are stored under controlled conditions at the Russian State Archive of Contemporary History. The room is sealed, access limited to select researchers. The pages rest under glass, yellowed by time but still legible. On one of them, written faintly in pencil beneath a passage about Stalin's pulse rate, is a line that feels more like prophecy than medicine. History is an infection. Once it enters the blood, it cannot be cured, only remembered. And so, the question remains, was Dr. Ivan Clune a traitor, a whistleblower, or merely a physician crushed by the weight of his patient's power? His confession, lost and found across the ruins of war and ideology, offers no clear answer. Only the enduring echo of a man who once stood beside the most feared leader of the 20th century, pen in hand, writing truth in a world that could not bear to read it.